Morning. Well, it's good morning here. I don't know where it is where you are now. So I want to now, on this video, want to tell you about the steps that took place to get to where we are now, which is source resonances and source sounds. And it may seem like it was a lot of steps. So it's quite hard to understand if you start from the final product, the final result, which isn't a final result, it's an ongoing process. So I just want to start by going through all the things that all the steps that happened. So the first step was a spiritual step, really. I had a hug from Amma. Amma's the hugging guru that goes around the world, or did so before COVID, and she gives you a hug. And that wasn't really, it isn't only what she does. She also whispers or recites a mantra in your ear, and you're also in her aura. So I don't know how that all works, but she's been doing it successfully. She hugs about 1,000 people a day, and she goes around the world doing it. Now, admittedly, people queue up year in, year out, hoping for something different, but I've never been before. And I heard she was in London, near where I lived. And I thought, well, I'm not prepared to go to India for a hug, but I am prepared to go to Crystal Palace. So I did. I'm a bit of a lazy type. So I got my hug. And it was all very nice and beautiful place. And I then had the common sense to go and sit near her and look at myself and see what was going on. And inside my head, I received this message, or inside my head, it's a joke. As an insight, I got the message, go to Africa and work on AIDS. That was it. Well, go to Africa and work on AIDS? I hadn't treated any AIDS patients. I knew friends who were homeopathic colleagues, gay guys, who treated gay guys with AIDS, and they were just firefighting and failing. And, great, they were doing it, but it was really hard work and not very effective. And then the drugs came in, and they were for the elite Westerners who could afford $10,000 a day, or their health services could. And they certainly weren't getting to Africa, but I didn't really know that either. Anyway, that was the first step. Go to Africa, work on AIDS. And being an intellectual sort of guy, I said no, in a way. I had other things I wanted to do, which are, well, they're not the normal sorts of things, but I actually wanted to go space traveling. And that had been on my agenda. It still is, actually. And I'd figured out an easy way to do it, which is to hitch a ride. I'd seen UFOs and things, and so I figured I could hitch a ride on a UFO. And I figured out where I might best do that, because I figured out where, from my contacts, where I think, and I thought it was in Southern California. So I went to Southern California with the idea of hitching a ride on a UFO. Right, but I actually didn't have the courage, so I didn't. And I went to a shaman for a session, as you do. And the shaman, after the second session, she sort of sat me sitting up, she said, Peter, just keep talking. And suddenly I started talking. And then she said, Peter, what was that you said? She said, there's a great big flame about 1.5 feet coming out of your brow. Oh, yes, I said, that's the secret I'm holding on to, which is go to Africa and work on AIDS. And at that point, I then realized I had no choice. I really had to go. So this bit's longer than I thought. But anyway, I got on, I started to practice in LA. I told my patients I was leaving. I told all my friends I was leaving. I had 2 parties to say goodbye. It was on my 60th birthday. And I sent out a message before that saying, I need to work on AIDS in Africa. Anybody got any ideas? To all the friends I'd worked with all over the world. And that came a time to start in Ethiopia on October something in Ethiopia. So, and the name, place. And so I said yes, and got on a plane, flew to England on my 60th birthday time, had birthday parties in England, then flew to Ethiopia. And it turns out, because the Ethiopia is 10 days behind on its calendar, it was still my birthday. So I had birthdays on 3 continents. Anyway, that's the first step. That's enough. you can read about that. There's a book called The Second Simillimum I wrote on this work. So it's 300 pages and all the facts and figures and cases, the hundreds of cases I treated and all the things that I did on HIV/AIDS. It's all there, fully documented with the brilliant results that it turned out to have. So having got that far, I realized that, so I went to Africa and I worked on, I started in the clinic and I made it, I just said, I'm not treating anybody except HIV. And at the time in Africa, HIV was a bit like cancer was when I was a kid. It was taboo, a huge taboo. You couldn't talk about it. No one ever died of it, although millions, literally millions of people were dying across Africa. You know, the criminals were dying because they were more liable to get HIV from their activities. The police were dying for the same reason. And vast quantities of people were dying, and no one was dying of HIV because it was too taboo. Anyway, so I set myself up as the HIV doctor. No one had to say that. I didn't have it on the door or anything. But I was in a large clinic where there were lots of doctors doing all sorts of things in little shacks around an open courtyard with dirty drains and normal stuff of Africa. And toilets which were unimaginably awful. And holes in the ground, and a woman with a broom waiting to sweep whatever it was you did into the hole after you, and no toilet paper and stuff like that, and no privacy. You know. Anyway, lovely. I still love that sort of situation. I just love it. I really, really enjoy being in those situations. It was really worthwhile. Anyway, eventually I discovered, I got a few patients and I realized that privacy was a major concern. So I moved to another place which had a big fence around it and a private door. And people could come in there and not be seen by anybody else. So then I had a stream of patients and I treated, I think 70 in the first 3 months and realized I hadn't got a clue, basically. And I realized that neither had homeopathy a clue. There was a huge hole in homeopathy. And and that was one of the big first understandings. Never in the history of homeopathy had anybody found a single remedy for a single epidemic disease. There were a few near ones like belladonna for scarlet fever, but there never had been one. And if you looked in the repertory, looked in the literature, you could never find an example of a single remedy always working for an epidemic disease. And yet, epidemic diseases were due to one virus or one bacteria, etc., as we know from today, but wasn't known at the time when Hahnemann was working with homeopathy. So I realized there was this huge hole in homeopathy called a single remedy for a single disease, and one had never been found by any normal methods. So I realized that, and when I took the cases of HIV, I saw that this was absolutely beyond anything of my experience, my 40 years experience or something, no, 30 years experience of homeopathy at that time. And I didn't recognize anything that would make sense. No approach made sense to me. And I talked to my colleagues. I flew back to Europe and I sent emails out around the world and asked for and explained the situation I found of remedies and of the picture of the disease, and asked for help from India to, you know, Western world and such like. He said, "Got any bright ideas here?" And there were lots of bright ideas, but they weren't grounded in reality. And I realized over the Christmas period when I wasn't in the UK was that there was no known solution to this problem, and I was going to run out of money if I didn't. I was already living on borrowed money, my own borrowed money, so to speak. I was going to run out of it, and it would be pointless if I didn't come up with a solution that worked. I mean, it had to be something very simple because it had to be, I needed the one remedy for one disease, which had never been done before. So I decided to get creative. Intuitive. I don't know how I am creative, but I've been creative since a very long time. I have my name on the first patent when I was about 24 years old. And you can look it up in the UK Patent Office or the USA Patent Office, and you'll find it against my name. And I think I actually did the work when I was about 22. It takes a while for patents to get filed. So I've been creative all my life, and I just figured that somehow I'd have to be creative again. And I don't know how I'm creative, but I stamped around and I did experiments, and no, I didn't do experiments. I thought about, I did a thought list of all the experiments I could do, all the ways I could make a remedy. And I tried one or two, no-sodes, for example, of HIV, and I was appalled at the result. So I then decided, when I got back to Africa, to do something different. And this is all documented elsewhere. So I made a remedy by intention for HIV. And it was, I tried it and it was really successful. So successful that it's been the best treatment for HIV in Africa ever since. Ever since, when I started, there were no antiretroviral. 10 years later, there were antiretroviral drugs. And 10 years after that, it's still antiretroviral drugs and the remedy that was called PC1. And it's still the best treatment in our analysis. And we've written a paper waiting to be published, which shows it is the best treatment for HIV/AIDS. Okay, so moving on quickly then. So when I realized that this works for HIV, I thought, this system is applicable to everything. Let's try malaria. I started trying it for malaria and other diseases. And I could make remedies or resonances for every disease, and each one I made worked. Not only did they work, but they worked the best ever, because they holistically treated the whole of the disease as if it was one entity, which is the principles of homeopathy, but expanded by this technology to a whole new set of remedies and a whole new set and whole new paradigm of healing. So the thing about this is, of course, that suddenly a holistic principle of making remedies applied to medicine, because one of the great advances of medicine is diagnosis. In the time of Samuel Hahnemann, there was no diagnosis really, and everything was a bit mythical. And they didn't know about germs really. And in that time, over a period of 200 or 300 years, diagnosis has been developed into a very well-refined science. Well, it's not that well-refined but it does, what they call diagnosis is the description of the disease, and not the cure of the disease or the treatment of the disease, or if the treatment is a mechanical supplement type of thing. But the real cure of the disease was not understood in the diagnosis, but the description of the disease was very well understood. And so it joined these two together. You could take the description of the disease and apply the disease remedy, and you got a brilliant result. So that was a major step forward. The next step forward might have been, I'm not sure the exact order, is that because I come from an electronics background rather than a chemical background, I didn't like pills. I prefer electronics. So I transferred the technology to sound. I had to say that was against a lot of resistance. My colleagues, who were very happy with the results in Africa with the pills and liquids, found it hard to swallow. And most homeopaths today still find it hard to swallow, excuse the joke, that you can do it by sound. But I was convinced you could do it by sound. I couldn't see any difference, although it took me a few years to believe it too. But we created a website called Healing Downloads, and we put on it all the obvious diseases, including things like herpes. The herpes is a Western disease, and that was important that we had Western diseases on the website, because no one in the West it's interested in treating HIV with sound or malaria with sound. That's just too far out and not in their remit, so to speak, their experience. Anyway, people with herpes who tried everything, anything, You know, bad found. Many of them reported back saying it was brilliant. So we got lots of empirical, anecdotal sort of information that the sounds worked. But in the end, just to satisfy myself, I went to Africa in about 2014, maybe, loaded with a lot of MP3 players, like small versions of a mobile phone, each one with a disease on it. And we had a clinic, and there's photographs in some of the stuff that we put out of the clinics with people with earphones, and listening to a sound. And in this clinic, was of health workers treating people only with PC remedies, as they were called then, and we call them resonances now. Anyway, a woman walked in with AIDS with a walking stick and blind and assisted by somebody else. And she'd obviously she was a very advanced case of AIDS. She was like terminal. And she was, the drugs, she'd been on antiretroviral drugs, and she was probably blind from the side effects of the drugs. Because it wasn't my experience or recorded experience, I think, that you go blind from HIV, AIDS. So she sat there with the sound on her ears. And after a few minutes, she blurted out, "I can see." And the whole clinic stopped as that message was sent out around the clinic. And after that, I had no problem convincing the clinic staff to use the sounds. And after that, you know, everybody, we just had a clinic with people sitting outside listening to the sounds while the next patient was being treated, the case was being taken and sorted out. And it was very dramatic, all sorts of things that were going wrong with people. We just put the earphones on them for that problem and boom, they were solved. So that was a huge advance, because when you think about it, pills don't go via the internet, sound does. And that was one of my obvious insights, that it was important to transfer to sound. So I'm just going to hang on a second. Yeah. So one of the next steps at some point was I went to Rwanda to treat HIV/AIDS as a result of the genocide, where the women, 9/10 of one tribe were eliminated by being hacked to death in a genocide in a frantic 12-week period, which was horrific and horrible. And I went there 10.5 years afterwards. And there were still many people traumatized, of the survivors were traumatized by the events. And the key thing of this was that they had flashbacks. It's called post-traumatic stress disorder, but the essence of it is flashbacks. Every time you think, you get a flash of the issue of what actually happened to you at the time. So if you were being raped, you have flashbacks to the rape. If you were being hacked to death, you had flashbacks to the hacking. And you couldn't really operate because the flashbacks were stronger than your thinking. So you're a mum, or you're surviving older daughter with 6 siblings to look after, and you've got no parents and nowhere to live officially. The people who did the genocide have taken your house, and you're trying to survive. And every time you try to think about what to feed them for the next meal, you go to flashbacks. So it's incredibly incapacitating. But just so as an aside, a flashback is the keynote of all sorts of traumas. So although post-traumatic stress disorder is heavy duty stuff that soldiers and genocide victims suffer from, everybody suffers from it in my analysis in the end, because it's stored up in the reptilian or amygdala. And the result is that there's a sort of broken record going on. And that needs sorting first. Anyway, I'll come back to that. So anyway, the results with the PTSD were overnight. Although I was supposed to be treating HIV, I treated PTSD and HIV simultaneously. The results again are documented, and it was dramatic. And we've since treated hundreds of soldiers in Afghanistan and thousands of people in refugee camps, and with great results. So that was another huge step forward in that we treated mental conditions as well as physical and had dramatic results in those situations. So the next step forward was the recognition, or realization rather, the recognition that actually most chronic diseases are based on acquired epidemic effects. They're either the basis of many chronic diseases, like in Africa, we would say to somebody, they come into the clinic with a chronic disease like arthritis, and we just say, and what happened before you got the arthritis? And they tell us they fell off a ladder or they had malaria badly. So we just treat them for injury or malaria and the chronic disease went away. That's a very simple example, but basically many chronic diseases in the West are due to inherited or acquired effects earlier in life and epigenetic effects from previous generations. So what we did was we found that we could treat chronic diseases. The obvious first ones we treated was sickle cell anemia, well, earliest was epilepsy, the earliest one. Epilepsy in Africa, I made a remedy for it because it seemed like an epidemic disease to me, though there was no logic to it. And the results would be that an epidemic, that a person with, say, epilepsy, with a grand mal every day, requiring full-time care at the age of 20, went from grand mal every day to a petit mal, which is a tiny twitch, once a week. And that made an enormous difference to this person's life and to the carer's life and everything. And, you know, epileptics in Africa often have terrible, horrendous burns because they have a fit near a fire when no one's monitoring them, and then they fall into the fire and get burnt. And before they're rescued, you know, they've got serious burns, which there's no burns units, so scars. So, so that was the beginning of treating chronic diseases. And then we found that we could actually get really good results with things like diabetes and high blood pressure and such like, which were very common things in Africa. So, and in the West for that matter, of course. So we found that because we had a new way of making remedies, we could make them for chronic diseases, which in a way, chronic diseases are like chronic epidemics within the human race, because there's only a limited range of them. Usually there's a few genetic things. 3% of diseases have genetic mutations behind them, but 97% are, you know, really epidemic of chronic forms of disease. So we found that it worked for them. Then, of course, we did some research. I did a lot of research. I started reading around, and we ran a clinic. Lani Van Coten, myself, and somebody else. We ran a clinic treating chronic diseases. And after about 6 months, and we treated all comers, we realized that actually we finally came to an intuitive idea that the causes of all chronic diseases are either toxins, infectious diseases from the past or inherited, traumas, physical, and traumas, psychological. We call it TIPS, toxins, infections, trauma. And I read a lot about this. I read around it, and I read around to see what other professors of medicine and various places were writing. And professors on the cutting edge were getting one of these things into their picture, but still not making in the whole picture. But because I came from a holistic perspective, it was much easier just to incorporate them all. And so we came to this TIP system, which is another breakthrough, because I mean, we've been using it now for close to 10 years. And while it can't be all that encompassing, there must be more to it. We found that it's pretty good, and it covers a lot of effects, a lot of the causes of chronic diseases. And you might say, well, diet and exercise are the causes of chronic diseases in many cases, torches. Yes, but those are the fact that people don't eat properly and don't exercise is, in fact, the consequences of a chronic disease, a chronic dysfunction, not caring about their lives or whatever. So what we see is that TIPS really covers the whole spectrum of things. So the next step was to recognize that actually there was a whole lot of technology evolving, what we might call smart risk technology and smart health technology, using chips, well, using computers on wrists and such like, which could monitor all sorts of blood conditions, all sorts of human conditions like blood sugar or blood pressure, etc. And you know, these were everywhere. Sports people were using them, but what they couldn't do was link up a treatment program. They could, you know, advise in diabetes. They could then advise people. You could tell people what to do with their insulin levels and whatever. But what we had and what we realized we have the missing link. We have the bit that allows you to take all that technology, put in an intelligent algorithm, and change the sound appropriately, so you have a complete diagnosis and treatment program all wrapped up in one application, one app. And that's another big step forward and an amazing consequence of having it as sound. The next step one of the steps which I made, connections I made quite early on, was we could apply this to peak performance. So we took a bunch of that Olympic level athletes in one country, and we offered to help them with their whatever they did, like high jumping, running, throwing the javelin, whatever it was, weightlifting, and some team sports as well. So we found that with athletes, we could make something like 0.5 to 1% improvement in performance just by treating something that was obvious with a sound. And that sort of 0.5 or 1% is very closely monitored, because their top level athletes have charts of their performance, you know, week in, week out and such like. So it's all very well understood. So it's an excellent place to study, because you can get results, see them. And we got between 0.5 and 1% change, improvements in what they could do, which sometimes is the difference between no medals and a gold medal. So, one guy I remember on the ice, he was an ice hockey player. With ice hockey, you need to be a certain weight, like 90 kilos is the sort of ideal weight, I think, because you come up against other heavy guys and there's an enormous collision. And the stronger and heavier that you are to some extent, but lean muscle, you know, that determines how physically capable you are. Anyway, we treated him with a sound based on survival instincts, and he stopped hesitating, which was the key thing he complained about. So if you're hitting the puck, you've got 1 millisecond in which to hit it and get it right. And if you hesitate for 2 milliseconds and then hit it, the opponents are going to be on you. It may not be 2 milliseconds, but you get the idea. It's very small fractions of a second when you're right in the cutting edge of hitting the puck. And what happened was he stopped hesitating, and he put on 7 kilos of lean muscle, something he'd previously failed to do. So that was pretty dramatic, and he changed teams and went up a league and all that sort of thing as a consequence. So that was another step that we showed that we could do it for peak performance, use the same ideas, and it applied across, you know, all the different types of sports as far as I could see. Then we applied it. We also applied it to learning, because I realized at one point, sitting in a clinic in Africa, that all the kids that came to see us, you know, they'd had TB or malaria or some such, you know, some early polio or some disease of early childhood. And I was thinking, well, how can you say, take malaria, which is the most common one, and the biggest killer in Africa? How could you sit in the class with smoldering malaria, which was common, and learn? Well, it doesn't make much sense. So I decided to make some resonances in combination, which is something I hadn't done before. So that was another little breakthrough, or big one for that matter. And I made one for epidemic diseases, one for trauma, and one for enhancing things like concentration and focus. And the results were, and they were 1 minute long, and I talked to her headmistress, and it was very easy. She said, yes, she tried it out. And within a week, she said, there's a difference. I could see her eyes lit up. She was telling me, they learn better. It's working. Anyway, we studied this for years, for some periods of time. And for example, in one country, the schools have a system of evaluation, which is nationwide. Every child in the whole nation has to fulfill this exam so they can grade the schools. And one school that was close to the bottom of the leagues completely became the second highest ranking school in the country. And we monitored 40 schools involving several thousands, many thousands of children, probably 10,000 children. And if there's about 200 or 300 children per school, which is what I saw. And we got a 26% increase year on year in exam results. And other things happened as well, like they stopped using the cane voluntarily. We never suggested it, but university, they stopped using the cane because it wasn't necessary, because the kids wanted to learn rather than had to be beaten into learning to learn. So that was another amazing advance. And hang on. So while it's not quite an advance, the obvious thing about sound is it doesn't cost anything to produce. There's a sort of management and there's overheads and such like. But basically, you can deliver the same system at an affordable cost across the whole world. And it's irrespective of space and time, so to speak. It doesn't matter whether the person's in New Zealand or New Guinea. Beside the language barriers, it can be delivered by someone sitting there holding their smartphone, and you type in the disease, you type in their name and information. Oh, that was another thing I'll come back to in a second. And you can deliver to them, put the earphones on, and you can deliver the sound for what's wrong with them, just like that, standing anywhere in the world. Or you can put the app on their phone, and they've got the treatment program, and it manages it all for them. Can you imagine how lovely that is? So you go to your doctor, he gives you an app. That's it. Amazing. To me, that's totally amazing. But one of the things we realized, another step we made, which was that we realized that the person, it was really helpful to personalize the resonance to the person, because a person has an identity, a sort of energy structure. And while you can't name that energy structure because it's not named by who their name or whatever, you can put enough parameters in to identify it. So we put a whole range of parameters in, like their name and date of birth. For example, the date of birth determines, from as we know from astrology, the personhood, the personal nature of the person. And you can critical astrology only if you've never been to a serious astrologer. If you go to a serious astrologer, and you will find that they will read your life for you and tell you what's going on, and there's no way around it. So astrology is just ancient psychology, but a complete map of the person, rather than modern psychology, which is still evolving. Brilliant that it is. Modern psychology is just evolving from scratch in the last 100 years, so to speak, whereas modern or ancient psychology is 15,000 years old, and it's called astrology. So we made a way, so one of the advances was another way of personalizing, which is very effective and ups the ante, so to speak, makes the resonance more effective. So that was another major step forward. So I think that rounds out at least where we've got to now, approximately. Yeah. So I'm just checking I am recording. I don't want to have to do this yet again. And well, I realized recently I'm an alchemist. I have to say that all these efforts, all these steps forward, it was a team effort. I might put my name to some of it, but actually there was a team effort all the way through. Lots of people joined in and helped me at various stages and helped and took on and did wonderful work. And the AMA Resonance Healing Foundation website is a tribute to that. And none of this work would have happened if I hadn't been supported by teams of people who sort of helped and clustered around and did things and made things happen. And I'm deeply grateful for all that. And without it, I just wouldn't be sitting here telling you. So anyway, one of the conclusions I've come to is that I'm actually an alchemist, because I looked it up, and funnily enough, I realized that an alchemist is someone, according to dictionary, who transforms lead into gold and invents new systems of healing. Well, I think I've done a few creative steps here, and with the help of others, I've created at least 2 new systems of healing, depending how you analyze it. But I could say 2 new systems of healing, but if not, 3 or 4. Certainly new systems of healing based on a whole range of revolutionary sort of steps forward, which have combined to form amazing new systems of healing. And I've also, part of this has been a spiritual quest. And if you look at my consciousness videos, you'll see that sort of side of me. And it's about helping people transform from what I call human beings to divine beings. And that's what Lead to Gold is about. Alchemists speak in code. If you read famous alchemists, by the way, are people like Isaac Newton, who invented the laws of motion, and other famous scientists also. He had the biggest library of alchemy books anyway on the planet at the time he died. So alchemy, I've just mentioned that because it might have a bad name, but so I've got myself as an alchemist, and right now I'm still creatively moving forward in steps that evolve what we've done, and there's more to come. And I can't tell you about those because I haven't got them in yet, but I'm beginning to sense some new steps that but it's like everything, once you get the ball rolling, it unfolds and unfolds and unfolds. So yes, and helping people step forward in consciousness, in their awakening, which is the #1 game of planet Earth, as far as I can see. All diseases, dysfunctions, and traumas and things are really steps to wake, hurdles or impediments or steps things you need to transform from impediments to awakening. And they're all steps in the path towards self-transformation from human to divine. And you can watch my other videos for that. And I think I've said everything now. So that's how Source Sounds, the app, came into being. And it took 20 years. And it wasn't funded by any university or any college or anything else. It was funded by friends and neighbors, and occasionally somebody gave us money a bit. And we've survived on shoestrings. And it's been a whole, it's been a double PhD, if you like. It's been a whole transformation of life, my life and those around, to get to this point. And yeah, I think I've covered it all, and thanks for listening.